Wonderful brothers and sisters, like I said, I like listening to conversion stories. And this week I took my time just to listen to some of the conversion stories of what some of our brothers and sisters have gone through. At times they are led to do things which are not actually approved of the Lord, but it shows that how God is so loving and is so caring that He is always ready to receive us back when we actually repent. Now, there was this wonderful brother who was actually against the church, and he was totally against it for 26 years. But after some time, the Lord actually helped him to see the reality, and he accepted the church, and he was again rebaptized into the church. I would like you just to listen to some of his stories, and we can know how to go about it so that it can be a tool for us also to learn. Because one thing I know is that you never know. Today you might be okay, tomorrow you don't know, because we are all subject to these temptations. And just like in the Doctrine and Covenants section 1, when you read from verse 25 onwards, the Lord had foreseen, and He knew that we will make wrong choices at times. We will fall sometimes, but He's always there to, receive us and lead us when we repent. And these are such like stories which are very uplifting. And that's why when we listen to such like things, ours is just to learn, not to condemn, but just to learn, so that we can be equipped with necessary wisdom on how to go about things. And without further ado, let me just invite you so that we can actually have a listen to the testimony of this wonderful brother. Please.
Marshall Walbeck, and today I've got a special guest in Dusty Smith, the Dusty Smith. Thanks for coming on, Dusty. Appreciate the time.
Thanks for inviting me.
So Dusty was in town. He's doing he's always doing firesides and devotionals. Ashley Stone from Comeback Podcast is doing this awesome event here in St. George, and I said, Dusty Smith is going to be in town in my city. I got to get him on the podcast. I initially heard you on Ashley Stone's podcast a couple years back, and it's one of my favorite podcasts she's done, having been anti-Mormon, firstly a convert, then anti-Mormon for 26 years?
26.
And then comes back to the church, and now he's just an Alma the Younger out preaching the gospel and sharing his testimony. 126 firesides, is that right?
Worldwide, yeah.
Worldwide. And so it's a privilege to have you on. And we just wanted to hear your story. I want to be able to ask a few follow-up questions, but I'll just give you the floor and let people know of your amazing conversion and reconversion story.
Okay. Well, I guess background is important because I wasn't raised in the church. As you said, I was a convert. I grew up, I was born in 1960, so I'm an old guy. The first 5 years of my life was with my mom and my dad, but my dad wasn't always the nicest person when he drank, and he drank quite a bit. And my mother would come in and she'd say, it's not you, it's the alcohol. And I said, I'm never going to drink alcohol when I was 5. Wow. And so I was raped. He left when I was 5, by the way, and had no contact with him. I was raised primarily by my mother with a lot of help from my grandmother and my grandfather, her parents. Now, the interesting thing about that dynamic was my mother was Lutheran, my grandfather was Catholic, and my grandmother was Baptist.
Wow.
So I spent my younger years going to all three denominations. Yeah. I was so confused, I wasn't sure if I should stand, sit, kneel, sprinkle, dunk, or pour. But I always loved the Lord. But I always wondered why there was so many differences between the churches that used the same book.
Right.
How could there be, why is there so many differences? But I grew up loving the Lord. I went to the University of Texas to college. In my third year at UT, a family friend was killed in a weird accident. She was running home from school, thought the glass doors on the house were open, they were closed. She ran through the glass door, landed on a piece of glass, and it killed her instantly. And I became incredibly upset with God. Why would you let this happen to this young 13-year-old girl? I stopped going to church, stopped eating. You know, I can't say I didn't believe in God, because to be angry at God, you got to believe God exists, right? You can't be angry at something that doesn't exist. But I didn't go to church. I kind of just turned my back. Graduated from University of Texas in '82. In '83, I went home to visit my mother. Well, I went home to wash clothes.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's more accurate.
Yeah. And the fridge was always full.
Yeah, that's right.
My mother had been to Salt Lake City on business, and somebody had given her a Book of Mormon. She was with the Veterans Administration, and somebody given her a Book of Mormon when she was in Salt Lake City, and she had put it on the bookshelf in my old bedroom. And so I was washing clothes. I wanted to read a Louis L'Amour Western. I was looking on the bookshelf, looking for a Louis L'Amour Western. The Book of Mormon fell off a bookshelf. So I sat down and opened it up and began to read, and I just happenstance opened up to 3rd Nephi, and I thought, well, this is interesting.
It's a good spot to open up to.
Yeah, I'd never heard this before, that Christ came to this side of the world, and so I became curious. So I went to the phone book and I looked up. And this is where y'all are really weird, because if I want to look up church for Baptist, you just look up church. You look up parish for Catholic. Ward or stake? Okay.
What is that?
Yeah, what the heck is that? Didn't know what number to call, but it was lunchtime and I was hungry, so I called the stake. and the stake president answered the phone. I didn't know he was a stake president. A guy answered the phone.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm never here during the week, but I forgot something on Sunday, came by during lunch to pick it up. And it just happened to be the stake president. So we chatted for a minute, and because of my curiosity, he suggested that I meet with the missionaries, and so I did at the University Ward, the University of Texas. And shortly thereafter, I was baptized. But I was a college graduate. I had a job. But immediately people started bugging me to go on a mission. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I'm never going to go on a mission. I'm a college graduate. I have a job.
Yeah.
I'm not a college kid who can just take a break during college and go on a mission.
And you mentioned a fiance at this time, too.
I had a fiance at the time. So I was kind of moving toward that settled life with a job and a wife and everything. And people would bug me about it. You should go on. And I was very adamant. I'm never going on a mission. So anyway, while I was at the MTC, I was 24 when I went on my mission. Yeah. And I felt like I was babysitting.
All these 18, 19-year-olds.
Oh, my goodness. Running up and down the halls. First time away from home. I felt really out of place.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, because when I became a member of the church, a lot of my family and friends turned their backs on me. Mm-hmm. When I quit my job to go on a mission where I was not going to make any money, they thought I was absolutely insane.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting there with these kids running down the hall and pillow fights, and it was just child stuff that I hadn't done in 5 years. I'm not sure I ever did some of that stuff. But I thought, well, if nobody cares if I'm here, I'm going to go home.
Yeah.
So I went to the payphone there at the MTC. I called church headquarters. And lady answered the phone, and I said, if nobody cares if I'm here, I'm going home. And she said, can you hold for a second? So I wait for a few seconds, and this voice comes on the phone. It says, Elder, if nobody else cares if you serve a mission, I do. My name is L. Tom Perry. So Elder Perry and I had a conversation, and he discovered my background, that I didn't have a lot of family support.
Yeah. So
he asked if I would be his pen pal on my mission. So I was. And when I got off my mission, he invited me up to his office to give him a mission report. After my mission, I went to law school. I went in a foreign country, Michigan. And in my third year of law school, which is, law school is 3 years, so my last year of law school, I happened to be at a position where I could go to Palmyra for the pageant. So I went to the pageant in Palmyra and encountered something that I had not encountered this was 89, so I'd have been a member for 6 years. I mean, some of that had been as a missionary.
Yeah.
So I didn't have a huge foundation in the church. I didn't have a lot of knowledge of history. I just didn't have a lot of background and foundation. And I encountered these antis, and they were everywhere in Palmyra. Mm-hmm. And I thought, you know what? I need to be better prepared for these guys. So I came back from that experience wanting to be better, smarter, more knowledgeable, kind of dig into things that I had never dug into before because between mission and law school, there wasn't a lot of time for getting into that. So, but I began to find things I'd never heard before in these old doctrine and old history books. And when you asked questions in 89, you were told, don't ask questions, just have faith.
Different culture.
One thing I love about the church now is the fact that they are more transparent, more open, even the warts. Mm-hmm. And I like that about the church. It's like we're an open book. I love that. But back then we weren't. And I woke up one day, after being told all these, don't ask questions, just have faith. I woke up one day and I thought, you know what? If they're trying to hide stuff from me, then it's not true. Hmm. And I lost my testimony. And I wrote a letter to the stake president. And I said, please take my name off church records. And a few weeks later, I got a letter that I've been excommunicated, which is what they did back then. They don't do that now, I don't think. But they did that back then. And that made me very angry.
Yeah.
And that's why I became anti. I decided if the church is true, it's my duty to advise everybody and warn everybody, help those in it, warn those out of it. And I spent 26 years doing that. I hated the church. I hated the church. There's a popular saying, people can leave the church but can't leave it alone.
Why is that?
It's hard to speak for everybody, but for me, and I'm probably the same as a lot of them, we feel deceived.
Yeah.
Okay. If I become a Baptist, my life doesn't change. I go to the Baptist church on Sundays. I go to Sunday school, maybe get a little involved in some of their community things, but my life doesn't change. I don't have to change how I eat, sleep, drink. Nothing changes. Become Lutheran. I don't have to change anything. To become a member of the church, my life had to change. I had to give up a lot of things that as a Texan, I love, like my iced tea. I love my iced tea. Mm-hmm. Okay? I still love my iced tea. I can't drink it, but I love it. Okay, but I had to give up things, and I gave up a job to, fiance. My fiance left me when I was on my mission, married somebody else. I gave up so much to be a member. Had my family and friends that turned their backs on me. I gave up all of that for the church, and I felt deceived. And so I wanted to warn people. I hated the church. No one likes to feel like they've been cheated.
Right.
And I spent 26 years doing that. When I was part of that, I was in the Army, but I discovered the internet. And I could argue with people from the comfort of my own home.
Yeah.
And I joined a group called What Do Mormons Really Believe? It was a Yahoo group. Mm-hmm. And I went to go tell them what they really believed.
Yeah.
And during that whole encounter, I was one of the most hated people on that website. But I met a guy named Mike. And Mike and I, although we had some really bitter debates in the beginning, became friends over time. And he would say, you're going to come back to church. And I'd say, I've never come back to church. I'll be your friend. We can have fun. We can chat. But I'm never coming back to the church. And in 2009, I was an attorney in Texas, and I had to go down to do a deposition in Laredo, Texas, which is right on the border. And had to do a deposition, and I came back with a souvenir, the swine flu. And we'll never know how many people the swine flu killed, because we didn't test everybody like we did for COVID.
Yeah. But
hundreds of thousands we know of died from swine flu around the world, probably a lot more than that. And there was no cure. Mm-hmm. And I was very, very, very ill. I was on my deathbed. I called the VA. I'm a disabled veteran. I called the VA, And I said, I'm dying. And they said, what are your symptoms? And I said, the ones you get when you're dying. And they said, you been to Mexico? And I said, yes. They said, don't come here. Nobody would see me. They were too afraid of the disease. So I'm laying on my deathbed. There's a knock on my door. And my son, my oldest boy, inexplicably lets into my house 2 missionaries. Worse than that, he brings them up to my deathbed. One of the missionaries, I kid you not, looks at me and says, you're sick. And I remember thinking to myself, well, the Spirit is strong in that one. And I told them to get out of my house. And they said, can we give you a blessing? And I said, will it get you out of my house? And they said, yes. So I got the blessing, and I was immediately healed. I don't mean that I got better over the next couple of days. I mean that in that moment, my sweating stopped, my fever broke. I was able to get out of bed for the first time in days.
Wow.
And I walked them downstairs and said, don't ever come back to my house. I hated the church.
So the miracle didn't create faith.
I always attributed back then, I thought, just because the church is false doesn't mean that God doesn't hear prayers.
You still believed in God.
I never stopped believing in God. I don't understand how people don't believe in God.
Yeah.
To not believe in God means we're an accident. I can't imagine anybody that I've ever met being an accident. Okay, it just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, you look around to beauty in life and you think that's just accidental. No, I don't believe that. Anyway, so yeah, I still believed in God. In 2014, jump ahead another 5 years, my wife got a job opportunity within her company. She'd been with the company for a lot of years, but she wanted to go, to gain positions in the company and get better opportunities. And this opportunity was in management, but she was going to have to move to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And I was in Dallas. We were in Dallas. And we decided that she would go ahead and do this, but that we would have this plan that she would do that. We would visit once a month in Shreveport, which was about halfway between Baton Rouge and Dallas. And we would meet once a month and at the in Shreveport until the same position opened up in Texas, and she could make the lateral move, which is better than a upward move, a lateral move, and everything would be copacetic, right? So she did that, and the district that she took charge of with her company, she was going to be in charge of the district that ran from Texas to Florida, and it was in the 40s. And she took that district and made it number 4 in the company. Her reward for that was in January of 2015. She got a call saying, we're going to close your district. You'll get your severance paperwork.
Oh, wow.
So she called me up and says, what do I do? I said, well, come on back home. We'll figure it out. Don't worry about it. We got this. The next day, the vice president of the company calls her and says, don't sign anything. There's a position open in Baltimore. Put your paperwork into Baltimore and hang tight, because it's a 2-week vetting process for any of these positions. So just hang tight in Baton Rouge. Put your paperwork in for Baltimore. So Suze calls me and says, should I do this? And I said, sure. I won't visit with you once a month in Baltimore, but we'll figure it out. But in the meantime, that plan is still in effect. You'll do that until the same position opens up in Dallas or in Texas, and you can come back. So I called my friend Mike, the one that's the member of the church that I was telling you about. I called him. I said, Mike, do me a favor. Would you please pray for Susan to get this position in Baltimore? Mike said, I'll pray for it. Now, that was a crossroads in my life. I should have said, thank you, Mike, you're a good friend, and hang up the phone. But I'm not that way. I said, however, if the Lord really wants me to be a member of the church, he will send Susan to Utah. Good plan, because there were no openings in Utah.
Yeah, safe.
Yeah, safe. No openings in Utah. I was that day. The very next day, the person in Utah retired. And the very next day, her paperwork was transferred from Baltimore to Salt Lake, and she was hired immediately without the 2-week vetting.
Wow.
So I called Mike and I said, "You're not going to believe this. Susan's going to Utah." He said, "Well, you know what you told God." Yeah. I said, "I was just joking." He said, "God wasn't."
Yeah.
So that's when I hit my knees. And I said, okay, for 26 years, I've had issues with the church. I've talked to your apologists. I've read your apologetics. Nothing works for me. Their apologetics just don't work. So if this is what you want, that's great, but I need answers, and I haven't gotten answers in 26 years.
So was this the first time where you were open to
Yes.
reinvestigating?
Yes. It's hard to ignore that miracle that just happened.
You called, he answered.
Yeah. Sometimes God parts the waters. Most of the time he just whispers, but now and then he uses a 2x4. You ever notice that?
I have. But it seemed like there was almost a little bit of desire or interest on your end by throwing that out to Mike.
If I were to be completely honest, for 26 years I felt the pull to come back. Okay, but I never accepted it as a pull to come back. If you were to ask me during the time that I hated the church the most, which it's hard to pick a year in the 26 years where you could say was the most. I mean, I really hated the church.
Yeah.
But if you were to pick whatever time during that 26 years before I got married to Susan and say, what was the best time of your life? I would have said, my mission. I loved being a missionary. And I looked back on my mission very fondly, even when I hated the church so much. And so what I thought was, it was the fondness of my memories of that mission that I was feeling for 26 years. It wasn't the pull to come back.
Right.
So when this happened, I thought, well, maybe it was more than a pull, and maybe I really do need to be humble about this. So I hit my knees, and over the next few weeks, I would wake up in the middle of the night with an answer to an issue that I had never heard before, but it worked for me. Until I woke up one day in March of 2015 and I had my testimony back. And
How long did that take?
Probably about a month.
Yeah.
Of constant waking up in the middle of the night with a new answer. And I wasn't talking to anybody about it. I wasn't talking to Mike about it. I wasn't, really wasn't sharing my feelings and my journey during that month.
Just
but
you and God.
And I would wake up and I'd think, I had never heard that before, but that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
You want an example?
Yes.
One of the biggest issues that I always had was archaeology. I would tell Mike, if I can walk the streets of Jerusalem, I should be able to walk the streets of Zarahemla. Mm-hmm. Okay? And Mike would say, well, it's because it was in the jungles are over. I said, Mike, I've lived in Central America. They're not going to build their cities in the jungles. They're going to build them in the mountains, on the lakes, by the ocean, not where the jungles are going to cover them up. No one wants to fight mosquitoes and snakes and bugs all night. They're going to, where the food is plentiful, by the lake, by the ocean, in the mountains, because I lived in Central America. I knew these things. So I had a dream one night during that time, and the Lord said, let me ask you a question. If you walk the streets of Jerusalem, does that make the Bible true? And I said, no. And he said, but if you're excavating someplace and you come across a sign and you wipe it off and it says, welcome to Zarahemla, population 450, what does that do? And I said, it makes the Book of Mormon completely and absolutely true. And the Lord said, then why would you need faith? That was the first time I'd gotten an answer that made sense to me. We don't know because we're not supposed to know yet where these places are exactly. We're not supposed to know because we are supposed to operate on faith. And if it doesn't take faith, then there's no need for us to even be here.
Yeah.
That made sense to me, but no one had ever said that to me before.
Mm-hmm. But it was the answer you got directly from the Lord.
And it worked for me. Yeah. And I'm not saying that answer will work for anybody else. Okay? The Lord will talk to them the way the Lord talks to them, when the Lord talks to them. But for me, it worked. And that's just one example. But there were several examples. And I woke up one morning and I had my testimony back, and I called Mike and I bore my testimony, and he truly wept like a child.
Wow.
For 20 years, he had put my name in the temple every week for 20 years. And couple of weeks later, Susan was living in Salt Lake. She had gotten an apartment, and I came to visit her. It was a long weekend for me. It was Easter weekend, and my law firm had Good Friday off. And it had the benefit of our anniversary because we got married April Fool's Day. So we thought that was appropriate.
Yeah.
So it was our anniversary. It was Easter weekend, long weekend. I came to Salt Lake to visit her. Now, as I mentioned, I'm a disabled veteran. I've had 6 knee surgeries. I've got screws in my leg. I can't run, but I walk every day. I walk 5 miles a day. And I was out walking in Salt Lake. And the Lord said, "This is home now." And I said, "No, it's not. I live in Texas. I have a house. I have a really nice job at a law firm.
Yeah.
No, this is not home. Me, Texan." The Lord said, "This is home now." And I said, "No, I've got a really good job in Texas and I have a house, Lord. You may have seen it." And he said, "This is home now." And I said, "Susan does not want to live here forever. We have a plan." I get back to her apartment and I said, "Hey, baby, out of curiosity, what do you think about Utah?" And she said, "I've been wondering how to bring it up to you. I truly don't ever want to leave."
Wow.
I said, "Okay, let me go back to Dallas and see about selling the house." So I get back to Dallas and I call a realtor. A realtor comes out. Now, I loved my house in Dallas, but it had issues. It was built in 1929. Okay, the foundation was kind of wonky, and we had the old screw-in fuses, not the flip the switch, so you had to unscrew a fuse and put a new fuse back in. I mean, it had issues. And the realtor said, "You can't sell this house." And I said, "Why not?" She goes, "Number one, you'll never pass code. And you'll spend too much money putting it up to code that you won't make any money selling it. You won't get what the house is worth." I said, "Okay." I called Susan and said, "We can't sell the house. Maybe we can rent it. We'll figure something out." Well, I got rebaptized. Right after the week after my baptism, I got a knock on my door. Guy says, "I want to buy your house." I said, "My house isn't for sale." He said, "Don't care. Won't buy it." I said, "That makes me happier than you can possibly fathom, but I don't have the money to fix this up to sell it to you and get it to code."
Yeah.
He said, "Nope, I want to buy it as is." I said, "How much?" And he told me, and it was more than the house was worth.
Wow.
I called Susan and told her, and she said, "Man, when God wants you someplace, He really wants you someplace." Now, the rest of that story is about a year later. We're sitting in the apartment in Salt Lake, and I get a phone call. The fellow says, "I want to buy your house in Dallas." I said, "I've already sold that house." He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Pretty sure. I was there." He said, "And did you get the money?" And I said, "And spent it." And he said, "Hang on." He shuffled some papers and he said, "The guy who bought your house disappeared. That house is abandoned and in foreclosure." That house sat abandoned for like 4 years. Somebody else bought it eventually, and now it's a nice looking house. They fixed it all up, but it was
strange.
Sat vacant for 4 years. A couple of weeks later, Susan and I go to Moab. She wants to show me the arches. And so I'm in the hotel room waiting for her to get ready. I'm kind of just walking around, patient. I like to walk. And I get a phone call. Woman says, "I see you've been on the church website and want information on the church." I said, "No, wasn't me." She said, "Well, sir, the only way that your name and number pop up on my screen is if you were on the website and want information on the church." I said, "Be that as it may. Wasn't me." She said, "Well, how do you suppose to tell me, sir, how I got your name and number?" I said, "I don't know, but my computer is in Salt Lake and I'm in Moab."
Yeah.
And she said, "You remember the church?" I said, "Let me tell you a story." So I told her my story, and she says, after I get done, she's in tears, and she said, I'm at the MTC and I'm having a crisis of faith, going to go home. So while that's all processing, he put me on answering these people that want information on a church.
Yeah.
Your name and number came up, so I called you. Thank you for your story. I'm going to go finish my mission.
Wow.
A couple weeks after that, another phone call. Woman says, "Is this Dusty?" I said, "Yes, it is." And she says, "Would you please hold for President Uchtdorf?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." And he gets on the phone and he says, "My understanding is that you left the church for 26 years and you were an anti, and you came back." And I said, "That's true." And he said, "Will you come visit with me?" I said, "Sure." So I go visit with him, and he says, "I'm going to use your story in general conference." I said, "Okay." He says, "I'm not going to use your name." I said, "That's fine." And in October 2016 General Conference Priesthood Session, on a talk about Alma and Amulek, he tells my story. In January of 2017, Susan and I go on a date. Well, we would go to a gun show. And I don't know how y'all date in Utah. In Texas, we go to gun shows.
Yeah.
But I needed a holster, and I saw a table selling holsters, and so I will go over there, and I'm talking to the fellow that's selling the holsters, and he said, "You're not from around here." I said, "No, I'm not." He says, "Why are you here?" I said, "Let me tell you a story." He said, "Wait a second, that talk that Elder Uchtdorf gave was about you?" And I said, "Yep." And he goes, "Can we chat for a second?" And I said, "Sure." So Susan and this guy and I walk over to a little quiet section of the Sandy Expo Center, and another fella at the table follows us over. I get done telling my story, and the fellow that had followed us over says, "You're from Dallas?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Oak Cliff?" And I said, "Yep." And he said, "You don't remember me, but 8 years ago you had the swine flu and I gave you a blessing."
Wow.
The rest of that story is after his mission, he'd gone inactive. Before the 2016 priesthood session, his bishop said, "I've had enough of your inactivity. Here's a ticket to the priesthood session. Go watch it." He goes and watches it. He hears the story, the talk about Alma and Amulek, and it reanimates him, not realizing that it was about somebody he'd given a blessing to 8 years earlier.
Wow, that's amazing.
It's just been one thing up. And look, there's been many more miracles dealing with my cancer, dealing with other stuff, but that's the story of me coming back to the church, my conversion, and then coming back to the church. It's been
Wow, those are very wonderful and uplifting situations and stories. And you can see how the Lord can actually use anyone. Sometimes the Lord can use you. And if you're long gone, forget about everything. But the Lord has a way of using his people. And he has a way of calling his children back. And that is one of the most uplifting stories I heard from this brother, which is very, very uplifting. And that one can really show you how God is so merciful and how Heavenly Father really cares for his own children. And I pray that most people will come across these stories, they will actually realize themselves and will make the right choices for themselves. And I pray that the Spirit of God will always guide us in understanding what Heavenly Father so requires of us. Otherwise, thank you very much. God bless you. Looking forward to see you again next time. Thank you. Have a great day.